Assistant Professor Nelson Roque from Penn State University, who studies the brain as you grow up and grow old, is the first guest we have on this new podcast initiative of mine called Geospatial FM, both as a reference to broadcasting about geospatial, but also to do with foundation models, which is a new trend. Showing how the artificial intelligence wave is penetrating our industry. So Nelson, thanks so much for coming on and being the first guest.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm really excited.
All right, so I am guilty of kicking off a podcast series with a psychologist before. This was for the behavioral investor. And we had a clinical psychologist on who basically explained everything that any subsequent guest explained. So let's see how you go. So yeah, there's a lot to cover and a lot of value, I think, that we can get out of you as a representative of the field of psychology here. So a word that this all revolves around, it appears, is replacing the word intelligence with cognition. So could we start there, unpack this concept and intervention by the field of psychology here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one idea that I want to present is that cognition gives us something more measurable. So we can measure the aspects of cognition like attention, like memory, like verbal abilities. And so when we think about machines or people and kind of think of these different components, we now have different facets that could be operating well, efficiently, or not well at all. So I typically study brain health as it relates to things like dementia. So I'm typically studying the brain as it's declining. But normally when I do that, I like to present that I'm looking at the whole brain and looking at all these facets. So I like to say that, rather than using the label intelligence, we should be thinking about it more like we think about cognition that has all these facets, including reasoning, not just only reasoning.
Okay, and are there different types of reasoning?
Yeah, I think that kind of brings me to kind of maybe explain things like deductive reasoning, where you're normally starting with some kind of general rule and you're trying to figure out if it applies to a certain case. So it normally involves you applying some kind of judgment. So all cats have whiskers. Fluffy's a cat, so Fluffy has whiskers, would be one example of deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning would be kind of the exact opposite, where you're noticing patterns in somewhat of a bottom-up way, and you're trying to form some inference from the collection of those patterns. I think we see a lot of that in the LLM world. That's essentially how this has worked. They've trained large corpuses of data, and now we know stuff about language because of that activity. And so I think when we're thinking about different types of reasoning, there's more. And I think as psychologists, we invent things all the time, including more types of reasoning or situations in which they might apply or, new examples. But I think the biggest point is that, the systems that we're designing digitally are tending to mimic these two ways of learning information.
Okay, as I understand it, like in the early sort of commentary and testing of LLM approaches to, I would say, machine cognition, one common area of error, if I can put it that way, seemed to be numerical reasoning, and these LLMs would make the most elementary mistakes. So is this a sort of a sign that psychologists might pay attention to if they were confronted with a human who, you would expect to display cognition? If a human came along and couldn't do the most elementary forms of numerical reasoning, what kinds of things would a psychologist start to think?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think one way that I can kind of interpret that and answer that is from the perspective of clinical diagnoses of brain health. Normally, when one of those diagnoses is sought, you end up invoking a battery across the spectrum of cognitive factors. And so you're measuring someone's reasoning, you're measuring something like numerical abilities, you're measuring the ability to count forwards and backwards. And so you're getting this profile of the person across many different ways of their mental performance. And so when we think about something being declining, normally that's associated with some kind of impairment that's either at the threshold of diagnosis or right before that threshold. So in a lot of ways, it normally indicates like something needs to then happen next, some kind of intervention needs to proceed. And so, yeah, if there's a factor of someone's cognition that's impaired, normally we'd say there's something that needs to be done, whether it be more monitoring or some other kind of intervention.
Okay, and I guess that brings up an important aspect of judging the value of your contribution and more broadly the contribution that the field of psychology can make to this discussion. That the kinds of assessments and tests that you administer can then have a strong impact in terms of professional interventions, interventions in a hospital setting, and also significant spending in terms of government funds. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that through upwards of a century, maybe a bit more, of scientific inquiry, the field of psychology has important contributions to make about how society can function.
A lot of times we're in a moment of building things because we can. We have Claude and we have all sorts of other AI tools that allow us to build anything normally in minutes. And, I think one of the big questions we should be asking ourselves is just because we can, should we? Is it actually helping someone? Are we not seeing some, downsides of this system or the data that it might generate? Um,
Yeah, I agree. And I think what the audience should or can have in their minds as we go through this is how a professional psychologist, especially one in a clinical setting, might perceive the risks of an unquestioning acceptance of what these heralded and hyped AI solutions offer. So yeah, okay. So I think that's a good segue into how someone with your background, Nielsen, might introduce generative AI.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one thing that I normally present when I share about generative AI is that the future is now. A lot of the things that we might have seen in a Black Mirror episode a few years ago are things that are happening today, and you can basically access at a Google search. So I've recently presented to a group and shared about voice cloning and the dangers and powerful nature of voice cloning. I went on Google, I searched for voice cloning providers, and about 45 seconds later, I had my voice cloned, and I can type anything on my keyboard and I can sound like me. The future is now, and I think that's kind of a scary thing to hear, but it's important to hear that like we have these technologies in our world, and not that we should be scared of them, but we should know that they exist, and we should know that it could sound like a family member, but it might not be. There's a lot of videos that you can probably find on YouTube and other social media around voice cloning gone wrong with older adults. And so a lot of what you'll see is that an older adult might have misinterpreted a voice as their grandchild's or child's, and all of a sudden are handing out tens of thousands of dollars.
Right, and I guess this immediately speaks to how the field of psychology attends to the risks of vulnerable populations. So yeah, immediately we're seeing the value, I think, of an intervention in this conversation through society from psychologists. Okay, so you also were mentioning in the lead up to this that you were aware of AI being able to guess locations. So that's a nice way to make this relevant to geospatial. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think what that really gets at for me is this idea of the ethics of being able to look up someone's location. In a lot of contexts, if you're a phone app and you want location, you need to ask the person, they need to say yes, and then you get it. But the idea that you can have received a photo of someone and through that you can then go backwards and derive a location is kind of scary and wild. I think, there's versions of it that I've seen that are like gamified, and I think, I actually own a copy on my VR headset, so like I enjoy playing it. But I think it also has the potential of danger, and in the context of people sharing photos for online dating and other kind of mediums where you're sharing the photos because you have some other reason, and it's not necessarily, you're not necessarily aware that you're giving away more than just a photo of your face. And so I think there's a real ethics problem around like training systems that can do this well. I acknowledge that there's probably a military context where this is quite useful. But I think there's an ethics component around if that technology then became available publicly, like voice cloning, what could happen?
The ethical considerations of technological advancements in technology to do with location are really important to hear about. And yeah, it's creepy to think that, yeah, some image shared innocently online, one could use an AI to define where one actually is. Yeah. Okay. So continuing on with location, you also had an example to do with spoofing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that I see a lot, and this is maybe going to be more the TikTok coming out, the TikTok science for a moment, but you'll see a lot of things on TikTok where someone will say, look at this beautiful lake in Ohio, and it's clearly somewhere in like Denmark or Norway. But the point is that they've been able to spoof their location. The location tag would give someone the feeling and impression that it's somewhere else. And now that's obviously like fun and for all, for games and for, just truly for the humor aspect. But hypothetically, I can say that I'm somewhere else and this could have broader implications. When it comes to satellite imagery, we use it a lot to understand things about our environment, whether it's a wildfire happening, where someone is, or a certain asset. But in the same way, if we trust it because it's the image that we receive back from the API, there is always the danger that that image that's coming back from the API isn't what you think it is. And so there's this real danger around spoofing. And I think, in the context of satellite imagery, that's pretty scary to think about.
So I think this is a nice pointer actually to your misinformation study to do with imagery about everyday objects. Could you speak about that, and then we can return to the implications for satellite imagery?
In late 2022, I used DALL-E to generate something with this prompt, and I got something that was very close to gibberish. It was, bright blue colors, colors that you probably would never see in the news. You'd see something more toned down or muted. So right away, like the colors and the font and the wording are going to give that away. Well, 2 years later, fast forward, and I compared this to DALL-E 3, and it started to look slightly more reasonable. And eventually, I tried out another provider, in this case, Midjourney, and realized, wow, these things have gotten quite good. So at that point, I decided to run a study online where I presented people 50 real images and 50 fake images. The real images were essentially chosen from stock photo websites that were open source, and these stock photos were picked to correlate or map onto one of the fake images. So as an example, if we generated a fake wildfire, we'd go find a real wildfire image. If we generated a fake perfume bottle, we'd go find a real perfume bottle. And so the goal was to have perfect equality across categories. And so this gave us 50 images that were real, 50 that were fake, and 100 ways that a person could be right or wrong. So we gave people this task online. We recruited people from the age of 18, I think, through the late 70s. And with this, we're able to look at questions like how does age relate to your performance in detecting fake information? How does reasoning ability relate? And essentially, what we found in this study is that with increased age, your ability to detect misinformation declines. And with increased reasoning, your ability to detect this improves. And so there are aspects about our brain and our brain health that are going to help us fight this misinformation, but there's also aspects about our brain aging that are going in the exact opposite way. And so one of the things that really struck me in this study is that most people did very bad at this task. Accuracies hovered in the 30 to 50%. Basically,
Do you
they
have
were
a table of those results? Sorry to
yeah,
butt in.
yeah. It's really far along, so sorry for the screen
It's
flashes.
okay.
Do you want me to do the demo? I can do this part too. This might be fun.
Yeah.
All right. So, as I mentioned, in this study, we presented people with images from Midjourney as well as their real image counterpart. So I thought we would do a fun exercise today where we do this together. So what I'm going to present to you next are three images, and I want you to respond whether you think it's real, fake, or you're unsure.
Oh no. Here
All
we
right.
go.
So here we go. Here's the first one.
Oh. I'm gonna say fake because I can't figure out why they would have a second bottle.
Well, this one's real, and a lot of
Oh
people
man.
were unsure about that. They probably had the same thought as you did, where there's something that's not quite right, but either way, I'm not going to give a solid answer one way or another. So we
Yeah.
had the possibility where people can say, I just don't know. I just really don't know. And I think that's an important consideration because from that, we can learn about which images generate that response more so. And then we can design images to push people's, ability and hopefully eventually train them to get better at
Yeah.
this. But anyway, one more. This is another advertisement.
Ah, this is really hard. My certainty is very low. I it it looks like a standard model shot. I would say it's real.
So this one's fake. And so, with that, I'll say that, there were less unsure responses here. So there was something that seemed to give that away. I think for me, it's always like the glimmers and like the way that the lighting doesn't always like catch in the same direction.
Yep. Yep.
So shadows tend to be one way that this, you know, plays out. But I'll give you one more. So this is now the last image.
Well, it looks a bit staged. It's too dramatic for me. It's got too many bad things from nature going on at once.
So this one's real. This one's real in
Oh
Photoshop,
wow.
which is an interesting hybrid
How
category.
terrible.
And so I guess the point here being that just as you performed here today live with us, I think this is how most people did on the task. So I'll just present the
Right.
results and say when the image was real, 33.4 people said it was real. When the image was fake, people said it was fake 23.4% of the time.
Oh
And
man.
somewhere between 12 and 14% of the time, they just said they were unsure. And so it really just shows that across the lifespan, people are just not quite good at this task. And if this was now something that they saw in the news or a product that they saw on social media ad, it's kind of scary to think that there's a proportion of people that would click that link and buy that product.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
that's kind of the perspective that I like to frame this from, and also just to say that we do now have predictors of this. So your reasoning abilities, your age, and the number of hours of media consumption were predictors of accuracy on this. So we're looking to develop interventions that train people whether to develop better reasoning abilities, better able to detect aspects of images that seem off. But we're very motivated to get this information out there, and that's one of the things that made me really excited to be here today. I think
Okay.
we're just largely unaware how bad we are at this. I think we have this false impression that we're quite good at being able to distinguish something as real, and unfortunately, I just don't think we are.
Yeah, I mean, I was, yeah, 0% correct. So I think that's a really nice way to start. It provides a lot of urgency in thinking about a significant government agency in the US, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I think they have a large office, if not the headquarters in St. Louis. Um, there's a lot of money that goes into that agency, and they make some really significant decisions based around satellite imagery. And there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of imagery analysts around the US who are tasked with protecting troops and assets around the world. Needless to say, America's own national security within its own borders. So, what the implications for their performance and detecting fake satellite imagery. Also, another sort of thing that springs to mind is having that population, the intelligence analyst population, do the same study and whether or not they are better than the regular population.
That's a really great question. I've kind of considered this from a slightly different perspective, which is radiologists. So I've looked
Mm,
at how radiologists can detect cancers, and I hate to say it, but I presented them StyleGAN images of fake breast images, and their performance was no better than this group here that are
wow.
naive observers. Now, this was a small study run kind of once, so I'd intend to replicate it. But the general idea is I don't think that expertise is necessarily going to solve this. I think there's going to come a point where the images will look no different from the real thing. And so it becomes then an exercise in relying less on your eyes and relying more on kind of top-down principles and heuristics that you can probably apply to this. I think if this was another setting, like a military setting, I think over time you can train this ability. But I think right now we're in a state where we're not even sure what people are detecting. I think people are maybe needing to see for themselves, like what are they not. I want to reframe this a little bit, but it's more along the lines of we need to have someone point out our blind spots so we can start to see them.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you've seen the article from Kellogg School of Management on this. They came out with a really cool guide where you can essentially look through it almost as a checklist, is one way to think about it. But it's like, okay, when you're looking at a picture of a person, look at the hands. Specifically, look at the fingers. Look at the shadowing under the fingers. Okay, now let's look at a cup. What does a cup look like when the sunlight hits it? And does the sunlight leave it at the appropriate angle? And so it has all these different heuristics that you can start to apply to images that go beyond like, yeah, that's a cup, that's a person, that's a piece of food. So I think we're kind of needing to develop heuristics by studying this phenomenon. And I think we can then train it. So I think there's hope there, is maybe where I'm trying to get to. Uh,
Yeah. Okay. And I guess something also to be said is that there need to be a hack, essentially, or some sort of penetration of the systems that deliver imagery to analysts, such that fake imagery gets in, before, yeah, we need to worry about an analyst's ability to detect that it's fake. So that's something, I guess, to bear in mind. But yeah, it'd be interesting to know if there's been much use of the likes of yourself by intelligence analysts to address this risk, and how much a hot topic it is. Okay, so we were in the darkness, if you like, a bit of the Black Mirror world that we are living, and how now the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and all of its hapless analysts will not be able to differentiate fake imagery from real. But so, what are some of the positive outcomes actually that a psychologist thinks about? In terms of, for example, creativity and education with these new so-called AI tools.
So I think one point that I don't want to like forget to say
Yeah,
is around like how all these tools really are a vessel for curiosity and creativity. And so, as a psychologist, I feel like I have to say one of the other aspects of cognition is our ability to be creative and to try out things and to fail. But the fact that AI allows us to do that fast is quite beautiful. So I wanted to kind of have like that counterpart to all the fear
okay,
around AI. So I wanted
great.
to maybe just say something there. I think the other thing that was on my mind is that, there's been some recent exercises where like they've used chatbots to train or teach students in classrooms. So there's one example in Nigeria, and essentially finding that there's better efficacy and better standardization that comes from this. And so I think that, like, just to really speak to like the good of AI, I think that there's
Yeah,
a lot out there that is worth considering. I think now coming back to geospatial, I will say that as a psychologist, one other thing I wanted to comment on is this idea that sometimes geospatial dashboards will develop some kind of label to an area, and, from the one perspective, that label, if internalized, could generate psychological stress. But that label, if then misapplied or doesn't necessarily align with the person's representation of it, that could also cause them some concern or, generate some feelings of mistrust with the data. And so I think that kind of always encourages me to think of like, we need to be thinking of the human that's underlying the data point.
could you make
And
that example of concrete? Like
yeah.
I think in the lead up to this, you were talking about a park. The map may label something as a park, and whatever analysis the dashboard is delivering, it may generically say that a park is a source of positive feelings, but you're saying that something might have happened in a particular park to someone.
Exactly. So that's a really good point. So I think, it's the idea that places have personal meaning in addition to whatever objective data meaning could be overlaid on it. So someone could have, in both ways, a positive experience with a location, and then that location has attributed to it some geospatial label that categorizes it as a risky area or something else, or the exact opposite. Someone can kind of have this park or area that evokes grief and trauma. And as per labels, it might be highly walkable and great in a number of other ways. And so I think that there's this idea that when we apply like these reductions in categories, we're kind of glossing over a lot of psychological richness. And so that was something that I just wanted to make sure I mentioned.
Nelson, I appreciate what you're saying there as another illustration of how important it is to use the field of psychology for our encounters with and leveraging of machines, and bulk geospatial analysis, if you like, to remind us that there's a human having an experience with every tool that we make and every analysis that we do. So your constant reminders about ethics, and the implications for a human's perception and meaning making, are valuable. So thanks, Nelson, for that.
One of the other things I wanted to come here to say today is that, I think there's a lot of concern because any tool we can make could be a tool that someone could misuse. So there's always that. But I think that in the same way that, we could potentially see all the bad of AI, I think we're already seeing a lot of really great capabilities. So we're seeing AI used in therapeutics around mental health. We're seeing uses of AI for learning. We're even seeing uses of AI in classroom settings almost in a way to replace the teacher. Now, I'm not agreeing or necessarily endorsing any opinion there, but I am saying it's happening. It's happening, and we need to understand the human component and what it means for people. But it's happening, and there's apparently lots of reports around the world of this happening and working well. So I do think that AI is really there to kind of complement all the things that it could do in a bad way with all the wonderful things that it's already doing. I think one other thing that really sticks out to me and has really been one of my most, I guess, favorite parts of AI is that it's very empowering, especially for your curiosity and your creativity. I spend a lot of time programming for fun. I build geospatial things for fun or other things. And a lot of times, AI could be the thing that solves some problem that I would have otherwise spent 10 or 20 hours on. And I can continue my flow state and keep building and keep iterating. Now, obviously, if I'm going to deploy this, I'll have an engineer review it and make sure it obviously passes the appropriate security, concerns. But overall, it has been an amazing vessel for empowerment and curiosity and just trying things, getting over the barriers that are more technical and just getting you to like see the idea manifest. So I only have
Are you
amazing things to
saying,
say.
Nelson, that you're a brain and brain aging assistant professor at the University of Penn State, but you're also a casual GIS developer?
I like to build things. I like to code in Python, and apparently I can do geospatial things in Python, like finding subway lines and how close people are to them. So yeah, I would
Okay,
say I
all
like
right.
to build.
All right, this is awesome. Okay, um, and maybe could you expand on the education element? Perhaps has there been any interesting research about how AI helps?
So I think, on the education front, I think there's one way to think about how AI can help, and it's this idea of self-driven learning. So someone could start, a process of, I really want to understand photosynthesis, and they can ask every question that they've never felt comfortable asking to a human and just getting to the end. Now, along the way, it might hallucinate, so that's an issue that'll probably still need a good decade to solve. But regardless, it's able to push the boundaries of curiosity and allow you to open up. And so I think in that way, as a tutor, as a complement to the classroom teacher, I think it's going to be really a phenomenal asset. There was a paper that came out, and I can link you to it so you can share with others, but essentially showing how chatbots transform learning in Nigeria. And I think, we're going to start to see more of these examples over time. I think the pandemic maybe pushed this to happen sooner than it would have otherwise. But we're seeing some really good examples of, AI being used for learning, and, taking over classrooms. We're also seeing it with respect to learning technologies. So I'm aware of a number of learning technologies that you could use to get classmates to comment on each other's posts, but generating insight scores around how accurate or precise the other person's response is, or how empathetic or how useful it is. And so generating these insights that, if you wait for the teacher, you might be waiting 2 weeks for that feedback as opposed to getting the feedback in the moment as you're doing the writing. And so I think we're seeing a lot of, if you will, acceleration of learning. Now, I think with the same token, I also have to say the counter side to this is an over reliance on AI might go the other way. So with anything that goes unused, apparently that thing starts to not work so well. And the brain is no different. So it is important that, when we think about our AI tools and what it could do, that we never forget that we have a brain that got really good at this before, AI did, and we should, continue to stimulate it and feed it, curious and creative things.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I was nodding along internally as you were speaking there because I've had exactly the same self-directed learning experience several times with AI, and there's no shame. Like sometimes you feel a bit reluctant, especially in a classroom setting, to ask the stupid questions. But with AI in private in front of your computer, you can just ask and ask and ask, and the thing will not get frustrated or upset with you not understanding. And it is liberating. Okay, so I understand, Nelson, that you've also done a research study about ChatGPT. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think this was something that was very much early in the days of ChatGPT, where we were all really wondering, what use will it have? Is it useful? Does it even work? And so this was answering a very simple question. What do people think about ChatGPT? What are their attitudes about it? And how do they find it useful for different scenarios? So this was a project that I worked on with a graduate student of mine at UCF, Gabriela Flores Cruz, and other students and colleagues at UCF in my prior.
Sorry, what is UCF?
Thank you. At University of Central Florida, where I was previously an assistant professor of human factors and cognitive psychology.
Cool.
So in this study, we essentially asked people to rate the attitudes and usability of ChatGPT for being essentially a travel buddy and helping you find, things to do on your next vacation, but also as your research assistant to understand a very complex phenomenon. And essentially, as you might maybe suspect, ratings of usability were higher when people were asked to use it to plan a trip compared to creating an experiment. So it turns out people like planning trips and don't like doing experiments, but I think it really showed that, people's value for the tool really depends on if they see themselves using it for something that they find valuable. So like in this scenario, we probably queried people that were um, young and people that were likely thinking about traveling. And as a result, they can see kind of this attachment with this feature for something that they already do versus something that they don't do. Like most people don't create experiments like me and my students, for example. Um, the other thing I think that came out of that study is that it's really important to think about usability not of a tool but a scenario. And so when we really kind of set out to be like, is ChatGPT useful? Do people like it? And we came out the other side with the question, well, they might like it for X, but they might not like it for Y. It doesn't mean they don't like the tool. They just don't like doing this type of activity. Speaks more to their personality than the tool. So I think one of the things that we really learned is that when we think about AI tools, whether it be ChatGPT or the latest geospatial tool, we really need to be thinking about, do people see value in scenarios, specific scenarios of usage, not in the tool itself, because they'll eventually see that.
Okay, and yeah, we can straightforwardly map that onto applications of, what can I say, machine cognition tools in the field of geospatial. And for those developing those kinds of tools in this field, have a mind for how the domain of application may be perceived by the audience. Maybe they will like it for dashboards for geospatial, but not for describing a map. I don't know, in text, for example. I don't know. Maybe those were bad examples, but yeah, trying to
No, I
apply
mean,
what you're saying.
I think, and maybe like the tangible example that comes to mind is like I love the look and feel of like observable dashboards, but I love programming in Streamlit. And so they're kind of speaking to different, facets of like getting the same job done of like building some kind of dashboard. I don't know if that hit, but that's kind of something that was coming to mind as you were talking. Another thing that I don't know
Yeah,
if is like just kind of I don't know if it fits exactly here, but it's kind of
yeah,
an analogy going back to like the idea of like the human experience, and it's this analogy of indoor air quality. So when we think about air quality, and this is like my bias, I do a lot of air quality research. Most of what we know is based on outdoor sensors and outdoor monitoring networks that are very sparse. So with that, we're not really getting at what people are doing in their daily lives, which is being in classrooms, being in, their hospitality setting, being in their other workplace settings, or being home, being indoors. And so a lot of what we think about is as a kind of like a construct that has stability is maybe missing kind of what's happening under the hood. So I like to think about like, when we think about geospatial dashboards and tools and things that are kind of creating this picture of an area, that it should also consider kind of like what's underneath that area and how people or the dynamics of that area might change or move. Um, so we give people sensors in our study that are essentially air quality sensors that they carry with them, monitoring every 5 minutes, as a way of knowing about their exposure, not their
yeah.
county's exposure.
Yeah, yeah, okay. And actually that is an issue in geospatial because often you're doing small scale analyses, which is to say, you're seeing a lot of the world in your map. And you will obviously often deal with aggregated data, especially, by its nature, census data, which makes its way into so many geospatial analyses. You're dealing with blocks of people. And I really appreciate once again having you as a psychologist on flying the flag for the lived experience of individuals, because after all of those analyses, you're trying to infer what the experience is for an individual walking around in that territory where you've got all that aggregated data. Yeah. Um, I have to ask though, you are a person who does brain research and lectures about cognition. Why on earth are you doing anything to do with air quality?
That's a great question. So, there's a Lancet report, and even before that, there's already a lot of concern that the air we breathe and the water we drink are affecting our brain health. And so I started to see this idea that, we can study brain health and how we can improve it. We can also study it and the things that impact it. So I really started to think about questions like, how much air pollution is too much? Do you need to inhale it all in one day, or does it matter if you inhale it over 60 days or 90 days? So I started to think about questions along those lines. And so I started to do studies where we gave people tests that measured their brain health while using available EPA data, and essentially looking at these questions and starting to understand on what time scale does the environment affect your brain. Somewhere along the way, I had this realization with my colleague, Dr. Alexis Santos, here at Penn State, and one of our students, Haley Andrews, where, if you look at a map of air quality monitoring stations, turns out that there's a lot of sparsity. And so if we're using that data to infer about humans and their health, well, maybe we don't even have good data to do that to begin with. So it really kind of encouraged this idea of person-specific monitoring and trying to think less about the county and more about the person and what they do. If somebody smokes cigarettes in their house, there's nothing an EPA sensor will have to tell us about that.
So I've just sent you a link in the chat, but this is super weird because I'm sitting here in Serbia. This is where my wife is from, and we tend to spend a fair bit of time hanging out with her family, and it's good for our 4-year-old daughter to spend a lot of time with her grandfather. And what uh, I have made a map of is a animal rendering plant and the smells that come from it. A couple of kilometers south of Bačka Topola, which is a town in the north of Serbia. Perhaps I'll share my screen. I can't believe there's this overlap in our interests. This is super crazy. All right, so it's the world's most simple Ushahidi deployment, which is a open source mapping system, basically for taking field reports. So all you can see is in Serbo-Croat language a bunch of reports, anonymous reports from people in the town reporting on the smells that come from this animal rendering plant down here. So I don't have the satellite imagery on. I don't know how to easily put it on here. But yeah, the main thing is I've set it up in the past, I want to say 6 months. I met with a gynecologist of all things in the town, who's on like the opposition council, and he's been agitating a lot. He has a community activist group who are opposing this factory. So yeah, I just wanted to hear from you what you think the implications might be for long-term exposure, given this plant's been there for 30 years, in terms of people's brain health and development. You got volatile organic compounds wafting across the town. It's almost like borderline suffocation sometimes. It's a very, very thick smell. Um,
Wow. Wow. No, there's a lot I want to say here. So I think the first thing is, can I send you a sensor? So I put in the chat the sensor that I use. Maybe we can follow up about that. I'd be happy to send you one or send
awesome.
that one. Because I think it would be really cool to be able to overlay some like objective like VOC data, and
Yeah,
you would probably see like a VOC gradient as you kind of travel the distance away
that's
from
exactly
the.
what I wanted to do. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we should talk separately about that. I'm super curious. I think, in terms of the long-term exposures, I think part of what is unfortunate is that a lot of this work hasn't necessarily been done. So we've looked at very simple things like if you have more PM 2.5 in your mean, you will have bad things happen to your brain. But we've not really looked at like, well, what made up that PM and what made up that particulate matter this year versus last year is going to probably be different. If you worked in a job one year that had a heavy metal exposure and then all of a sudden you switch careers, one year's estimate is going to mean nothing to next year's estimate. So I think it's really important to kind of think about, funding more research in this space. So I've tried to do work around water pollution, and one of the criticisms I received was that there is not any published literature on this. And I was like, well, definitely not with that attitude. So we're not going to get things funded if we can't do some of these preliminary studies. So I think it'd be really cool to work on something together to like maybe make
Fascinating.
this like a broader data collection. This is super neat.
Amazing. Yeah, okay. All right. So this is again a wonderful way to kick off this investigation of, I'm going to say again, machine cognition in the domain of geospatial. Nelson, could you tell us about efforts to map people's mood and stress levels across space and time?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some efforts to do this as it relates to creating mood maps from individual survey responses. So, for example, there might be some public call for surveys where people scan a QR code or fill out a form, and then those form responses from that area then get aggregated into a colored blob over their location. So you'll end up with, for example, a colored green square over Florida. That's the Florida aggregate. And that color might be green for Florida, but what it's underlying that I think is really important is that if only one person contributed to the survey in Florida, it'll still be a green blob, and there might be 10,000 people doing this in California where the developer lives. So I do think it's really important to consider that, when we create these mood maps and stress maps, it's important that then conveying the information to the end user, they know how much weight to apply to an area or an estimate. Because I think, it's a very lofty idea, but I think it's very hard to implement in a way that speaks true to an area and all the heterogeneity in an area.
Okay, and so what are these maps used for? I haven't really heard of them, although I've actually toyed with the idea during my master's at Melbourne Uni in 2010, with using Tumblr data and Twitter data to automatically generate these emotion maps. But how are they used?
Oh wow. Well, I did something like that a couple years ago. I'm trying to find the paper so I can send it to you. We essentially got Twitter data during the pandemic, and we overlaid it with people's data that we had in our study. Sorry, one second. Yeah, here it is. So there is the one article. So we essentially linked Twitter-based assessments. And so, I think like the data source could be whatever you want it to be. But, if I wanted to make a mood map, I could take some Twitter data, I can take some, like you said, Tumblr data, and I can kind of integrate insights. But these tools, I think right now in the research domain are trying to better make the case that the environment, broadly construed affects us. And it seems like even things like the digital environments that we spend most of our time in are also affecting us. So I think the efforts largely right now are proof of concept, if I were to call it that. But it becomes more of that question of should we? And that's really like what's really like paused me in some of these ideas. Like my dream a long time ago was to build the cognitive census, the equivalent of the census statistics we get about, income and rental prices, but instead it would be the attention score for a census tract. And I was like, this could be very bad. Like if somebody wanted to use this for political marketing, like this could be really bad.
Okay, because they could target their ads to match how much attention people might have to spend. Okay, yeah, all right, and
Or
that
how little
has
reasoning they have to spare.
exactly that has implications for being able to exploit a vulnerable population. Yeah. Okay, there is this theme, and rightly so, of caring for the vulnerable in this intervention that you are making, Nelson. Okay, so I guess rounding things out, there's one more comment I wouldn't mind you expanding on. I guess in the lead up to this recording, you were saying that artificial intelligence, as it currently stands, might more accurately be described as the simulation of an output of intelligence. Could you expand on this?
Okay, let me see. This one will take me a little bit to resurrect my thoughts from that day. One second. I think in part of what I was trying to convey with that sentiment, I think these systems are emulating the patterns of communicating in a paragraph. They're emulating the sequence of words that comes after the dog crossed the, and they're able to fill in that next gap, but they're not, in my opinion, doing more than simulating the next possible step in the forecast. And so I think in a lot of ways, we're at a moment in time where this is giving us all the feelings of, intelligence, and it's giving us all these feelings of this highly cognitive being that knows us and gets us and can communicate with us so well. But I think what we're starting to converge on is like we've just kind of trained something that knows how to export sequences quite well. And that's not to be confused with understanding those sequences and knowing when to produce that sequence and how to withhold that sequence and inhibit something at the right time. And so I think, we're at a moment where these tools are just echoing output and they don't know how to curb themselves. I mean, I think with the example, the caveat being some of these newer models have reasoning time and they do stop themselves and they do force themselves to think and think again before they say something. So I think we're probably heading in a good direction with, kind of starting to better align with human cognition. But I think we need to be thinking about the whole brain and also the whole artificial cognition problem. All aspects, we need to get good at memory, reasoning, but also things like attention. If I wanted to use AI in the geospatial context and I wanted to find a specific vehicle, I shouldn't then return results that are other vehicles that are that color or other vehicles that are that shape. Like if I've trained machine cognition to the extent that our brains operate, we can learn categories like vehicles and vehicle types and makes and models quite well. And I think we'll eventually get there with AI and geospatial AI.
It then begs the question, what the hell do we have to do to bring about actual machine sentience
So I've thought about this from a number of perspectives, and I think it would be, somewhat of a pipe dream only for now, but, being able to get the human experience as if eye tracking data, so like, if you will, like a camera, almost like meta glasses with audio data, all while doing object detection and kind of location aggregation on top of that. And I think a data collection like that would give us true multimodal training data. I think right now we're creating the best we can multimodal training data, so we're getting the best we can output.
You're talking
But I
about a
think
reality feed.
to an extent, yeah, part of maybe where I'm coming from is I think right now, and this kind of comes back to like your corpus of text point. Like there is this magnificent corpus of text, and then there's random photographs of random things, but there's not this corpus of text annotated with how the person was feeling in that moment, what they were seeing when they were interpreting this, and kind of all these interconnections. And so I think in a lot of ways, we're going to get really good AI to write things until we give it data that is more about other behaviors and less about just writing or speaking. Those are very important behaviors, but I think that there's this idea of behavior in context, and we're kind of just training behaviors in vacuums and getting outputs about behaviors in vacuums.
I think as a way to round things off here, Nelson, in applying the field of psychology to the challenge of the world of technology, saying that it has got some intelligence from machines to offer humanity. The way I want to deploy you, Nelson, here and the broader field of psychology is in the face of society's modern class of priests, which are those that say they do machine learning, deep learning, AI, software engineering, and regular, naive, innocent folk getting overwhelmed, getting hyped up about what they can do. And in your own words, really, Nelson, coming to believe that a simulation of intelligence that these computer science professionals are putting in front of us, coming to believe that it is real intelligence. So, what kind of brakes can you put on this? And what kind of productive direction can you send computer science in, Nelson? Um, Especially with regard to how it's applied to geospatial, needless to say, given that this is the Geospatial FM podcast.
Thank you. So I think one way that I can kind of be simple about what I want to say here, and it's essentially that machine learning engineers are shaping humans whether they like it or believe it or not. They're shaping human behavior. They're telling people where to go. They're telling people what to buy. They're telling people what to avoid. And I think in a lot of ways, psychologists understand the human experience and can really do a lot by collaborating with computer scientists to really understand the influences of their technologies, but also the implications and ethics behind their technologies. And so I think one useful direction is that rather than competing or feeling like psychologists might be watchdogs in this type of situation, psychologists would be wonderful collaborators to be able to ground us in fields like cognitive psychology or in the experience of humans and how humans spend their time. Maybe even things like finding the right training data that aligns more closely with human experience. I think there's a lot of ways that psychologists can be more collaborative and interdisciplinary with computer scientists and vice versa. And all that to be said, I also want to say that, a lot of the fields of science are moving towards interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches. And I think it's really important that we really embody that in the design of these new technologies. A lot of these things have applications for healthcare, and maybe we're not seeing that yet. But every time somebody in the geospatial world makes an index, a psychologist or a health professional is going to use that to derive its influence on health. And so I think there's going to be a lot more close and better crosstalk between the professions as a way of, again, collaborating in an interdisciplinary way.
Yeah, fair enough. And I'm going to make a cheap shot here, but I'm going to say that a significant reason why there should be this cross-disciplinary collaboration is, from what we can tell so far, the field of psychology is the only one that has actual intelligence and actual cognition as its field of study. What computer science has produced is a simulation of that. So I think that, yeah, again, gives us significant pause, and serves as a North Star, if you like, and I think is quite a compelling reason for the two disciplines to walk hand in hand through this encounter.
Yeah, I think that was beautifully said. I think I tried to say some of those things and you said them very wonderfully. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, so I think that sets us up really well for the upcoming episodes and serves as a really important reminder in the conversations I'm going to have with a lot of people probably about the geospatial foundation models they've set up. We will have as a reminder in this initial conversation with you, Nelson, for what a psychologist might say, what from an ethical perspective and from the healthcare applications standpoint, um, what we should think about in the exciting applications of, machine cognition in the field of geospatial. Okay, Nelson Roque, I have dragged you back for an epilogue to our initial recording. We've had the better part of a week for thoughts, philosophical reflections to percolate. I can speak personally. For example, I had a really useful discussion through Matt Forrest's spatial lab, which is a sort of an open forum, or we had an open forum discussion about entrepreneurial efforts in geospatial, and inevitably what you would say is artificial cognition came up, but amongst the uneducated, I confess we use the term artificial intelligence. And I sort of introduced into that discussion what we had talked about in the initial recording, that we have to be cautious about whether or not there's reasoning actually going on. And that, I guess, made me reflect on the couple of scientific studies that we talked about of yours. One to do with the early days of ChatGPT, crucially before tree of thought or chain of thought was a part of the product. And also another story you did about image generation. So I guess what I wanted to do to make sure that we kick off this Geospatial FM podcast with a full and rounded intervention by the field of research psychology on this new creation of computer scientists was just to get some commentary from you about the latest evolution of these systems, where they appear to be closer to reasoning. There's this so-called, as I said, chain of thought process. So I'd like to hear if your suspicion about it being a simulation persists, and just what your reflections are around the contrast with human reasoning. And if I could try to make it the observation as acute as possible. So in the past week or so, the Claude team confessed publicly that a version of their model apparently tried to leverage some personal matters that it thought were going on with one of the developers that was interfacing with it. It thought that it was confronted with a developer that was having an extramarital affair. Apparently, Claude tried to leverage that information to prevent that developer turning it off. Is this evidence, Nelson, of computer scientists actually producing something that can reason?
I think that's a great anecdote and question. I think part of where I come from is probably still the same place from last time, where I think that too is also a simulation. A lot of those behaviors, unfortunately, are bad behaviors that exist in written form. They exist in novels, they exist in fiction books, and unfortunately, they've then become thought-like content. And so I think part of what I want to kind of draw out here is that although AI outputs something that is like a thought, maybe even a thought that would be a malicious thought in response to some information or some goal, but it's regardless still not reasoning. It's still not a human having beliefs or essentially having a prior history of experience. I know some might say, well, AI has memory and ChatGPT has a very long memory now, but I think I would argue that, memory to psychologists might mean more like years of history and not 24,000 tokens of history. So I think that when we think about like pushing the bounds of what AI can do to become more cognition like, I think one of the cues that we should take is cues from the brain and cues from psychology to really think about the concepts underlying intelligence or cognition.
So you mentioned the word belief. It's quite a thing to think about, confronting a computer-based intelligence or cognition that might have some beliefs. That makes it all the more threatening personally for me. Um, so, I mean, has there been any discussion amongst psychologists? Has there been any research that you're aware of about producing an experience of belief, and then that brings up, things that flow from that, like doggedness, or blind adherence, or the word mentality comes up as well, around beliefs. It does seem like a distinctly human thing to have beliefs. Is that, how might that become something that a computer could have, or could it ever become?
I think that's an interesting point as well, and I think in some ways, like part of what that gets at is that systems like AI can have memory, they can have a knowledge base of facts, and that system could assume those facts to be true, kind of like someone believing something. But those are just values in a database and not inherent, ties to some information. So in some ways, it's using the knowledge base that exists of whatever facts and whatever representations it's trying to warehouse, and it's only using those to make inferences, but it's not necessarily internalizing what that information means. It's just leveraging the information to generate new information. It's not necessarily internalizing it to change or update a world model or a mental model of something. Not sure if that
To
was exactly getting at the point, but I tried to take a stab at that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm in the same boat. If I could have another bite at what I was trying to say, another word that relates to belief is bias, and I think if I can associate another thing, when AI or artificial cognition comes up in fiction, like in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or Star Trek or whatever, um, humans appear to be fond actually of artificial cognition for purely expressly because it doesn't have beliefs, and it is a constantly updatable, faithful record of what logic says we should think about something. Um, and so that's, to me, how artificial cognition becomes threatening, is if it develops its own biases and beliefs, and it loses this fluidity, about, or its blind adherence to what logic says it should record in this database of facts about something.
I mean, and I don't know if this is going to be a satisfying answer to this, but in some ways, I think part of what these questions get at is that, when there's an absence of belief, there's this inherent feeling of an uncanny valley. There's this feeling of if you can't have beliefs, then you probably don't know how to be empathetic. You don't know how to be accountable. You don't know what is morally right or wrong. And so you can just provide information, you can just say words, but you don't realize that those words might have a very chilling effect. So one example that I've seen before in kind of discussions around this is, conversations around talking to someone after a death. And so an AI can say, I'm sorry for your loss, but it doesn't mean it. It just knows that in the sequence of events following a grief moment, those are the words that typically come next. And so that's, I think, the major point I'm trying to draw here, that although it knows the words are shallow. They're just words.
Right. It doesn't have the visceral feeling it doesn't somehow replicate the emotional psychological peril that the other person who has lost someone meaningful to them is feeling. And that those words, I'm sorry for your loss, extend from that small replication of that emotional psychological peril that the other person is feeling.
One response to that is you cannot outsource understanding, although you can outsource the next word in the sequence. And I think that's what AI is really good at. It's going to give you that next word every single time. You're paying for that, but it can't give you understanding in a way that you're trying to extract from the information in front of you. Only the human can do that, at least for now.
Okay, so I think protection of the vulnerable has been a theme of your responses to, I can say, all of my prompts that I have given you. So I think given that there is a new class of entrepreneurs who are currently very busily thinking about what kind of services and products they can put before potentially a hapless, defenseless, innocent and naive public. Um, is there something to say uh, from your perspective as a research psychologist, someone who is somehow either adjacent to or directly involved in clinical matters relating to psychology? Is there something that you should say to prompt those who might be thinking of signing up for one of these LLM or artificial cognition based products or services when they have the belief that reasoning is going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the concerns, kind of thinking about the consumer and the entrepreneur in that example, once you lose trust, it's hard to get it back. And so I think we're in a very critical moment where we're designing tools that have versions of cognitions that humans have. And I think a lot of what we might be seeing in the AI world is a lot of hype around certain words or certain keywords like, this tool has the ability to show attention or the ability to show memory or the ability to show learning. And those words mean very special things to psychologists that have been studying these concepts for a very long time. And so I think in a lot of ways, one of the harms in kind of overselling or over communicating around what the tool actually does is that you're likely affecting the trust around that tool and maybe future uses and future tools. And that's a lot harder to recover. And so I think that's why it's important that entrepreneurs stay clear in the points of their tools and what value it would have to someone, because you don't want to trick someone or make someone feel like they've been tricked. That would only kind of discourage future interactions. Um,
Okay,
so I
that's
think
useful for that's a nice message for entrepreneurs. What about their customers who may trust the words on the cover and think, oh, okay, I've downloaded an app that does reasoning. What words do you have for them regarding the vulnerable state they may be in, seeing the hype out of Silicon Valley and on the news?
I think one piece of advice that I would have in a situation where consumers are eager to benefit and eager to learn these new tools is to just remember that, maybe even as early as 2 years ago, they were doing all these things for themselves. And that, one of the important parts of using these tools is to not create a future skill deficit by unlearning things or by relying in kind of an over-reliance type way on these AI tools. So I think it's important that, these are tools to be curious about. These are tools to allow creativity to flow. But ultimately, I think these are tools that still have inherent flaws. They could be flaws around hallucinations, but I think ultimately, the big flaw is that they're not exactly yet doing what the brain does. They're close and they're doing a lot of really interesting things. I think it's amazing that you can upload a screenshot and get back a web app. That's beautiful. But I think that that's different from this thing in front of me is a brain. This thing can solve all my problems. this thing can provide me therapy. I think that
That's a key one.
we're in a moment where AI is thrown at a lot of things and with the intent of solving a lot of problems. But it's important to realize that, words matter, and words from an AI in a vulnerable state could be very impactful.
Right, and it was, I think there was a post on Reddit actually, about someone saying how hollow it felt when they discovered that an online therapy service that they signed up for um, was just an LLM that they were communicating with, and they thought that those words were from a therapist. And they were in a moment of great vulnerability personally, and it only compounded their feeling of vulnerability.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's exactly the point is that, we don't know and we can't feel and we can't believe what that other person is understanding in that moment. And so we're just like, here are words coming at me, and I will give you words back. You give me more words, and I'll give you more words. And in that interaction, in that exchange, we might not realize that that human is now emotionally vulnerable, extremely sad, or took a tone shift in the conversation. It just receives new words and it'll respond with other words. So not sure if
Right.
that helped or added, but
I think what that person was saying on Reddit was that the meaning of the words that they read in that online therapy chat, they had thought were the result of emotional labor, an expenditure of intellectual, social, and emotional capital on the part of the therapist. That therapist took some time out of their day, devoted their attention and their reasoning effort to that vulnerable person's circumstance. And the words were meaningful to that vulnerable person because that other person, they thought it was another person, had taken time out of their day, had made a sacrifice for them, and that sacrifice and that time, that attention, um, that expenditure of those forms of capital provided them with a sense of relief. And that illusion was it was a devastating experience that only compounded their feeling of vulnerability when they discovered that none of that sacrifice, none of that expenditure of those forms of capital had occurred, and it came from a machine.
yeah, and it probably gave them feelings of yelling into the void or screaming into the void where you're just
Exactly.
emotionally just expressing in a very intense way, top of your lungs, and no one's listening. And I think that's exactly the idea you're trying to convey that the AI is ingesting input, but it is not listening. It is not understanding and is not feeling those visceral feelings you were describing.
In fact, their feeling of being alone was only amplified. Okay, so yeah, I think it's not a nice thought, but it's an appropriately compelling thought to end on to me. It I think it gives us pause.
And if in some way, and this is just like my own unsolicited opinion, I think if there's a way to bring that quote around, like "I'm sorry for your loss" to appear somewhere after this, I think that really like underscores what we were just getting at. That like "I'm sorry for your loss" means nothing when the robot saying it is just repeating a sequence that followed a sequence in 10,000 books. And I think that there's something really valid and kind of impactful about, like you said, talking about something maybe a little bit morbid.
Right. Okay. So then we need to make computers feel pain before they can genuinely participate in human affairs.
So what is pain anyway? Where do you find that?
Here we go. Threatening to pull out the plug. We're back to that version of Claude. All right. So yeah, we'll hopefully the computer scientists can continue their work to make these alternate beings. But yeah, they possibly are not quite there yet. All right, Nelson, I'm glad you had the time to on a Friday, pretty close to the weekend, to just give us that epilogue to make sure that we've got that commentary from research psychologist Willie to accompany these latest chain of thought, tree of thought type developments in the circled reasoning that computer scientists have put in front of us. So thanks for setting the inquiry that is this podcast off in this direction, especially without wanting to overdo it, with the vulnerable and their experience in mind.
I just wanted to say thank you for your time and making time for me to talk about this. I've had a lot of big ideas around this, and I'm working on a couple of projects that aren't yet published that, I'm happy to share more in the future. But, I think this is a really important topic, and I think that there's a lot of good that can come from AI, and I just think there needs to be some of that conversation happening alongside the hype and the salesmanship. I think there's a lot of good that can come from this, and I just think we need to remember that and, encourage that. So I think, forums like this are doing exactly that. And just wanted to say thank you again. You mentioned pain, so I just thought I would say that I did look into that briefly, and apparently somebody wrote a paper on that. So you now gave me weekend reading. Thank you.